I knew I would eventually get to the ultimate wrap-up, and there it is. There's been the problem all these years, is I keep showing up in person. I got to tell you the truth, I knew that, I just didn't ever want to have to face it. A soothsayer told the king who came seeking extraordinary knowledge, "It is not possible to describe to a blind man the beauty and joys of a sunset." And the monarch replied, "But I'm not blind." To which the wizard responded, "Well, I didn't mean it literally, it's a metaphor, for Christ's sake." And the sovereign said, "I'm no child. Don't speak to me in parables. Talk to me outright, like a man." And the soothsayer fell silent for a bit as he attempted to regroup what intellectual forces he had, then spoke again. "Okay, Mr. Kingy, look at it like this. You came to me wanting to hear about things of a wondrous nature, and I told you right off that it was not possible to describe to a blind man the beauty and joys of a rose." And the royal one interrupted, "Hey, you said a sunset." And the magical one retorted, "Sunset, rose, what the hell difference does it make when there's no possibility of you ever hearing anything new that might conflict with what you presently believe to be required for you to hold on to control of your kingdom?" And when told of the conversation later, the prince reflected, how much more true the wizard's words when applied to the relationship in one's own mind between those dominating life-generated thoughts and possible self-generated upstarts. An undervalued property of metaphor and allegory is their protection of those with limited vision. A man once so confronted a mystic, "The mind can certainly deconstruct life, but it cannot put it back together." And the mystic gave no response, being not one to deal in the futile. A lad asked his father, "Which is more correct, when men say that people are driving me crazy, or when they say I'm driving myself crazy?" And the old man replied, "I'm disappointed to see you still wrestling with the perceived distinctions between the heights of various ants." And the boy pondered on this comeback for a bit, then said, "Do I take it that you're pointing to the hyperspatial lack of differences between lower level distinctions?" And don't bother to answer, I know that you are. And of course, by now, all of you know that the moral to such stories is that it is always good for a progenitor and progeny to have such conversations as long as they're genetically conducted within oneself. And now tonight's mental farm health news. Cows can only go mad while among other cows. Thus, those in a bunch are always safe. If you're not trying to hold, focus, and expand your consciousness, you're not really doing much with it. Another distinction between the routinely religious and those who know on what it is truly based is that the former believe their enemy to be evil spiritual forces, while the latter understand a greater problem to be what they last ate. There was once a planet that was attacked by automobiles with loud, blaring radios. And the native creatures under attack, for some reason, believed that the source of the auto's power was in the radio. And thus, futilely, thereto directed their defensive efforts. As should be obvious to one and all, even of this world, is that no incursion, no matter how well fought, is of any consequence if it is pressed against an irrelevant foe. A correspondent offers the following. When I originally looked upon man as being divided into the general groups of the simple and less civilized, and the more complex and more civilized, and realized how much more attention the simple give to their physical life than to their mental one, I at first assigned this to the fact of their relative simplicity. But now, after some years of considering the matter, I wonder if it is not due merely to the fact that man's physical life remains of superior importance to his mental one. And while this observation may have some merit, do note this, that no one captive of either group's mentality can ever comprehend it. Here's how it goes. Out in the street, in the midst of the city, with all their enthusiasm, it's still almost impossible for a 20-year-old to understand what this is all about. And though it may be more likely for a 50-year-old, their problem is they lack the enthusiasm. Another hallmark of ordinary minds is their consistent disregard of the harmonic component of consciousness. One intergalactic traveler made note that the most difficult aspect of visiting worlds other than your own is in the fact that you can never speak their language. And he was asked if someone capable of such travel as he described should not surely be able to handle the learning of a new tongue. And he, not being given to futile verbiage, gave no reply. Ordinary people claiming that they indeed do want to know the truth about life are like children playing hide-and-go-seek, who have hidden and unawares to themselves do not in fact want to be found. This is no indication of stupidity, insanity, or duplicity on their part, but is unwittingly based on the fact that, due to life's silent urging, they do not want the game to end. Just here, just now. Usefully speaking, no one can properly desire the journey's termination until they have a full knowledge of the journey. Absent this, all such longings are expressions of fear and ignorance. Did indeed men have expanded mental hearing, they could comprehend the cry to turn your radio down. Another glance at the difference between consciousness and thought. If we take the city of Istanbul again to be a metaphorical picture of an expanded state of consciousness, and we wanted to describe it, the absolute best that could be done would be to describe every other place on the planet but Istanbul and leave it at that. There is the distinction between consciousness and thought. The head of a certain knightly order reaffirmed one of their alleged initiatory requirements to one who had inquired. Yes, it is true that an applicant must first be able to carry a hot coal for 20 minutes without using his hands. And the one inquiring replied, I take that what you say you do not mean in the physical sense. And the knightly one, by way of response, said, do you plan to apply for admittance? And even after this, the one who had instigated the conversation remained unsure. A boy once asked his father, why do men ask questions to which they truly wish no answer? That's an easy one, my boy. It's because they are men. Historical footnote to the above knightly story. The now near innumerable names for the transcendental quest came about due to man's ultimate boredom with its original one. Control. That's all. Control. Regarding mental health and comprehension, what is required to be sane is to simply have your thoughts more or less in line with the majorities. This is also all that is necessary to remain in the dark. And now news from the public spiritual front. Men are not drawn to religions because of what they promise, but rather due to life's constant need for new sycophants. Ass kissers. On the trek up the mountain to that elusive peak, travelers eventually find that it is not the physical climbing that tires them, but rather the talking about themselves. A viewer writes, considering what you recently said about something becoming sacred, if enough people pretend that it is, caused me to further ponder the question of whether without such pretending anything would be sacred. And if not, well, that brings up an additional area for investigation. The writer is beginning to stumble onto the never-ending nature of the world of word and thought and of civilization itself. The one world created by man and for which he alone is responsible. A responsibility he discharges with distinction, even awash his constant doubts that he is doing so. A faithful servant is always uncertain. The imperceived, equitable distribution of all, and not excluding certain, things. A man who will cry about one thing will cry about everything. At the mental level, life-generated thought is like water is to a fish, while the self-generated version is like a man's attempt to produce his own water. As he lay on the floor reading about the exploits of some of man's more renowned explorers, a boy paused, looked up to his father, and noted how often did their ultimate discoveries turn out to be not what they had originally expected to find. And the elder lowered the book in his own hands and responded to the observation. Indeed, 'tis so. Had Columbus, Magellan, or Marco Polo known at the time what they were doing, we today would have never heard of them. With that, they both returned to their reading, but a moment later the father added, expanded into a more interesting realm, this would also include Buddhism and the like. Through the eyes of the mind is not possible undistorted sight. Amongst things that can die and which cannot be revived, aspects of civilization cannot, in the manner most glaring and absolute. Life cares about man's wanting to go back only to the degree of allowing him to dream about it. There was once a flimsy cardboard city constructed on a once open plain subject to fierce winds. And many sensed the reality of the situation and expressed their criticism thereof. Criticism that, unbeknownst to them, helped keep the marginal structure standing. Absent a realization of this all-embracing situation, a would-be warrior never tastes triumph in that, by his disapproval of his opposition, does he succor thereto provide. One king's caution to his knights, having no way out is not the problem. Having not this knowledge where appropriate is, and is. What to an intelligent man could be a greater example of wasted effort than wasted effort? The uselessness of having heroes in the land of man is the same as why no matter how high a particular tree may grow in the forest, they're all still anchored to earth. Even though of the same mother, only the more conscious know where to suckle. One way to spot the routine steppers on life's dance floor is by the fact that they will keep on dancing even after the music stopped. Simply another tracking of how man's mental life normally moves onward. Another distinction relative to where you are and what you see. Reality, universal. Descriptions, always local. When you ride the mystical express, you look to the engineer. When you finally understand where it's going, you become your own. Part of civilization's responsibility is to make men's lives seem to be of more significance than they are. This in return for man having invented it, I suppose. Trying to describe to a pen full of pigs, no matter how friendly they are, a place where pigs have never been is like trying to describe to a pen full of pigs a place where pigs have never been. When unadorned, reality covers it. What need is there for metaphor? More sporting news from the civilized fields. If you want to play ball in the city, you're supposed to keep your eye on life, not on yourself. The big picture can always be destroyed by the minor details. On one still growing planet, as pertinent to the individual effort to surpass the gate of the majority, it is said that such was impossible for anyone under 30 years of age and improbable for anyone over 50. When it comes to windows of opportunity, mystics were the original kids with rocks. And lastly, regarding the matter of ignorance and intelligence, only the more conscious actually know how dumb they are. Hey, hand me another rock. To pick up the final piece that I did not get to last time, using the allegory of within one closed system, the oceans of the world, from the smallest little creature building on up to larger and larger, and then up to El Charco, which by all descriptions is king of the oceans. Absolute. There's nothing, anything else in that context, no other creature, through any sort of physical, or if they were capable of any other means, there's no way that they can overcome the shark. He's the head of the food chain. And now I pointed out that contrary to not only that situation, but those on dry land having to do with just the food chain, the chain of domination, is we have a situation without parallel on this planet having to do with man. Because man can overcome a shark. A man can interfere with this natural state of domination, but only by, there's one requirement. He has got to get the shark out of his environment. A man cannot jump in the water barehanded and overcome a shark. But man has the ability, no other creature in the water has the ability, and since they can't think, they certainly would never think of doing it. Only man has the ability to overcome the shark in that particular scenario, but even then he can only do it by getting the shark out of the environment. That is, pull him out of the water, partially or wholly, but to get him out of the water, enough of him, long enough, that he simply suffocates. That was the first stage, which seems to be pretty straightforward, and in this case you can take it metaphorically or symbolically. That means what it means and something else. But then if you move into what would appear to be metaphorical, the metaphorical stage would be what I was calling the second version of my little story. It's where you could look at the water as being the level of consciousness in the human nervous system, as I normally draw it, into the area of the cortical intellect, into the area of the brain where man thinks, and you can look at it the same way that this level is represented between man and the shark, is now separates man's mental life from his bio-survival physical one. And you can see it as being a struggle for the man's mind to overcome, dominate, but to overcome his bio-survival, less civilized instincts. And the third one I just started on But let me make it clear. What I was referring to would be so-called, well, people involved with such as this. And what it's attempted then is this whole scene is only of any pertinence inside of one man's head. And it is then is his self-generated thoughts, his self-generated consciousness attempting to overcome life's generated version. That is the final telling of it. That is what this has always been about, no matter what guise, no matter how it's described. And since I knew that that would take up most of the evening, we only have time left to point out that the big picture can always be destroyed by the details. The setting is thusly. Sign on a vacant lot, general locale, let's say Orlando, Florida, says parking only $2 per day, easy access to all major tourist attractions. And a gentleman parks his car, pays his money, and begins to consult his map and even ask the man to whom he has paid his money to park about which way to the Grand Canyon, and then becomes upset, to say the least, upon learning where he is now presently parked in relationship to aforementioned major tourist attraction. As an aside, at least, I guess we can all see that the man who is behind the venture of offering parking for only $2 a day did not engage in any direct untruth in advertising, because he could ask the disgruntled parker or point out to him that there is unencumbered access to the Grand Canyon. He could ask him the rhetorical question if the man says, well, the sign says easy access to the Grand Canyon. And the man who had just taken his $2 and he owns a lot could go, so what's stopping you? The best I can make out, he could check his little compass there in his watch and go, the best I can make out. I mean, it's directly that way. It's hard to miss it. There's not the, it's a real big, it's a big canyon. It's not one. It's hard to miss. Just what's stopping you? I was afraid, thank God I was incorrect, that some of you might just find that humorous. But do you realize that from one quite valid view, even though we know in the ordinary world of commercial and social transactions that anyone who did park their automobile in Orlando for $2 a day, albeit a fair, an exceptionally fair price, nowadays, given the situations in most major urban areas of this planet, particularly the Western world, and particularly Florida, I might say, that there is no doubt that that is a more than fair price. And the sign said, easy access to all major tourist attractions. The man did not engage in anything untrue, even though, as I said, we would all agree, any ordinary person would not find it strange that anyone who availed themselves of this parking opportunity, even though the price is fair, and then pointed out when they parked their car and got out, got their kid's stroller and their wife and kiddies, and they had their little cooler, and said, well, what we're interested in is Mount Rushmore. And the man says, well, the best I can make out, all right, see where we are now? Just keep the sun. Well, I said, what time is it? Keep the sun right here on your left, and just, like a 45-degree angle, and just due moi, just straight ahead. And the man looked at his map, or maybe perhaps asked the man, said, do you have any idea exactly how far it is? And he says, well, I'm not exactly sure, but I would estimate, just more or less, I'd say between 1,000 and 1,200 miles from here. But there are no major encumbrances. I see no reason why it is not a direct and easy access directly from Orlando to that area of the Dakotas, or to that area of Arizona if you're going to the Grand Canyon. The big picture to start with, man's pulling up, driving around his car. Assuming, I think it's safe to assume just in general that all of the parking areas that he would normally pass in such a tourist center as Orlando, that I'm sure all the parking was in excess, probably many times over, of $2 per day. But he suddenly sees this sign, parking $2 a day, easy access to all major tourist attractions. There, for the sake of this one scene, there is his big picture. The man, they're there, he and his family, to visit major tourist attractions. They're there on a limited budget. They're there to get the biggest fun for their buck, the most park for the dollar. That's the big picture. He tells his wife, tells his kids, keep your eye peeled for a good place to park that has easy access and is reasonable. That's the big picture. By all intents and purposes, when they turn the corner and see the sign, they have stumbled upon, they have become, or they have the opportunity to step into the big picture. Then by God, they have just ruined it. The man destroys it by such petty details. After he's parked, paid his money, he's got his receipt, looks like a safe neighborhood. The man was pleasant enough that took his money, welcomed him there. Then he begins these kind of petty annoyances. He begins to involve himself in these kind of minor details of beginning to complain once he finds out the distance between where he is parked and the Grand Canyon. Am I going to have to assume that no one sees any connection between that and that? All right. If that's the way you want to do it. You know I can always up it. The kid who was reading about some of the histories, some of man's more renowned explorers, and notes to his father how common it is, by all reports, that they discovered things other than that which they originally expected to find, that rather than what they planned to see. And without trying to go into historical detail, that should be enough information for anyone with a cursory education, which nowadays, or all days, normally constitutes an education. You should know enough to understand that the father listened to his observation of his son. He said, indeed, 'tis true. But if, and then he just picked out just some examples offhand. He said, Columbus, Magellan, Marco Polo, Captain Cook, Lewis and Clark. He points out, he said, hey, had they known what they were doing at the time, today we would have never heard of them. Then added, expanded to a more interesting degree, a more interesting realm, that would also include such things as Buddhism. All right, now come on, you can't tell me now that you don't see the connection between that, the destruction of the big picture, by becoming concerned with minor details, and that. Now you can't tell me that. Well, even if you can, don't tell me that. Well, if we're going to have to deal with any of them, I'll start at the back. Much of history, taken as being a kind of non-physical genetic blueprint, forward, backwards, and sideways of man, that history is composed probably second only to warfare, which is generally simply an offshoot of exploration, but at least put in direct mundane words, at least second in familiarity for inclusion in history, is the explorations of man. I don't know of any, well, I know that there's not any widespread consideration of the fact that the kid pointed out in my story. Not that I couldn't say this to an ordinary well-read person and them say, well, it could be true. But there is no widespread interest or notice of the fact. Like I said, it's not hidden, but no one seems to notice any pertinence thereto. The fact that what history there is of the explorers, whether it be fairly recent, like space exploration, or if we're back into the Renaissance, or if we're back into the Greek, what little record there is, let's say in the Western world, of the Greek explorations, the Romans, Caesars, them expanding the frontier, they would speculate and sometimes just be absolutely convinced of what they were going to find through myth, through story, through supposition, through whatever, but it is just common that explorers rounded up the money, the backing, the wherewithal, and they go off, but no king, I'm assuming that you're still running your own symbolic parallel to all of this. No king, no government is going to put up the money if a man says, if a would-be explorer says, I want to go off and sail off what everybody says is the edge of the earth, or I want to go further up that way than anybody's ever gone. And he says, why? Now you do understand this. As always, I have to bring life down to, in the affairs of ordinary man, down to a reasonable level, which makes it sound simplistic. No king, if the explorer says, after the king inquires, well, that sounds interesting, but what do you expect to find? And the guy says, I got no bloody idea. I mean, the king's going to reach for his checkbook immediately. Well, of course, he might if he had the intellectual wherewithal and the stability, say, of a King George the fourth or fifth, or it was. In other words, if the family line had been around long enough for inbreeding to bring about that kind of shocking but regal mental infirmities. At any rate, we know no reasonable banker, monarch, anyone with the wherewithal is going to finance an expedition with absolutely no expectations. They're just not going to do it. They never have. And so the explorers always have some story of what they expect to find. And whether you had ever thought about it again or not, and as I said, ordinary historians, there's no real common notice paid to this, even though I'm sure that many of them would agree to what I'm saying. They just wouldn't see any significance. But the fact is, if you just read a little, as the kid did in the story, that the explorers always have some proclaimed expectation as to what their discovery will be, at least in general. But then the common reality of it is that what they discover turns out not to be what they expected. And we're not judging right or wrong, because it was of sufficient significance, or we would not know about it now. It would not have made history. But it is most common for them to discover something other than, things other than, areas other than, but just to discover something other than they expected, other than they planned, other than they announced they expected to find. The kid made the observation. It was rhetorical. He was asking the old man, like, that's kind of weird, isn't it? That it just, the more I read, it's just common. And the father said, yeah, you're correct. It is common. But look at it this way. If at the time they had known what they were doing, that they knew what the outcome was going to be, we would now today have never heard of any of them. Since we've got a couple of seconds, how about take a couple of seconds and just ponder that one? That's kind of so good, I'm not going to stop really and say anything about it directly, but consider. Because that would stand alone. That could be the end of the news item. That if they had known what they were doing at the time, today we would have never heard of them. Then my little story presses on that after they had gone back to their respective reading, the father did look up one more time or look down and said, by the way, if you're capable of expanding that into an area of more interest, which is real interest, this would also include such things as Buddhism, Jesusism, Mosesism, Muhammedism, that would include that now he had changed the stories you should expect, or he changed the potential level of their discussion from physical exploration to explorations that could be of some interest to a kid that sharp. That is, the internal explorations. And then again, I refer you to the fact that when someone undertakes this kind of quest, sooner or later, strike that, sooner than that, they can't even feel as though they're on any sort of quest until they find some description that strikes them as being agreeable. That they find some description at the point of this kind of, or they find a book that more or less says somewhere. They find some writings that go, hey kid, have you got the answers? Do you seem to have the answers internally? Do you seem to have the kind of itches and answers that no one can not only tell you where to scratch, they do not even seem capable of understanding your descriptions of the itches? And you read and you read and you get more and more enthused. And it said, well, here's what it is. You are one of the people who have been struck. You were born with a certain kind of disease. You were born mystically curious. You were born wanting to surpass the gate of everyone about you, non-physically speaking. And a little kid goes, you should have gone somewhere, more or less. Now I know what it is. Now I know where it is. Now I'm getting somewhere. Well, yes and no. Now you can feel like that it's possible to get somewhere. Because then, some sentence shortly after that one, once it seems to establish, or once it attempted to establish, even if it's coming from hundreds or thousands of years ago or hundreds or thousands of miles away, that once they have rhetorically established that, or answered the question of, are you reading what you should be reading? Should you be someone pursuing this? And you've come to the conclusion that yes, this is it. You are talking about, that's it. As vague as you've been thus far, these first few paragraphs, the first few sentences, yes, you say to the book, the writings, yes, me. Now I know. Or now I see that someone knows. And it says, all right, go on to chapter 1 then. You may now turn the page. So you turn the page and it will immediately give some sort of description as to what one might expect. If it did not, if there were not such descriptions and did not people, it has nothing to do with a matter of intelligence or stupidity or ease of deception. It's that you have no other recourse. But
hey, Cal?
Yeah.
There's still no picture on that.
You turn the power on, I guess. Is there a power button we can hit on that TV?
That's a pull kind.
Oh.
Oh.
a life-generated weather glitch on the tape, viewers. So shortly after, immediately after you find any written indication, some record somewhere that seems to be speaking to you insofar as you yearn to travel, it must immediately give some indication of what the location might be, what you might expect. And I'm being somewhat lenient in my descriptions because they will normally be much more specific, saying if you will faithfully follow this particular Zen teaching, or if you become a true adherent of this particular Sufi approach, God willing, and given 30 or 40 years, here is what one will see. And they describe it. It is never what one expected to find that one finds if one makes a discovery. This is not the proof of point, but obviously some of you, I can tell, will get the gist of it. Anyone who says that, yes, I have faithfully devoted my life to being a blank, a Catholic, a Sufi, a Zoroaster, and if they say I have devoted my life to it, and you go, and they go, it has paid off over and over again, And if they say, and if you say, well, and so the promises originally made by the religion, by the mystical system, the promises were kept. And they, oh yes, oh yes. This is not to prove anything to ordinary people. This is for a few of you. You do understand that that means that they have not learned anything. They have not moved. If they tell you that yes, the goal that was established, the location named, that which was promised to me when I undertook this particular identifiable quest, oh yes, oh yes. They did not lie. I have found what they said. You may be assured that they have found nothing. Because if you find anything, it will never be what you expected to find. That is not a discovery. Put in the context of my story, the father pointed out that if these explorers had known what they were doing at the time, you wouldn't have ever heard of them. Somebody mentioned Magellan or Captain Cook or Cabot, and you'd go, who? Their names would have been lost forever. No consequence whatsoever had they found, or the way the father put it, if they had known what they were doing. Inherent in all such as this, by now as you should know, there's no chance. It's all mutually inclusive and exclusive at a hyperspatial level, is that for one to know what they're doing, you can look at it either way. If they knew what they're doing, that perforce would mean that they would never find what they expected. Or looked at the other way, anyone who went off on exploration and did not find what they expected, it is only those people that you never hear of. Ha-ha. Or you want the childish version. It's only those who go off on an expedition and find what they expected to find that you ever hear of. Which for those of you getting any better, again, it has nothing to do with the externals of it. But it's why, from one quite reasonable view, from one quite expanded view, I should say, that of no particular consequence, but if indeed there was such a person as Buddha or Jesus or Zoroaster or Lao or Confucius, if there was such a figure as those people, it is certainly not the ones you heard of. Because the ones you heard of were like their evil twin who failed in the attempt. That is, it was like their evil twin who showed up in the middle of the soap opera, its run, and announced, "Ah, I discovered it." That's the only way you hear of them. You didn't get lost, did you? Anyone who knows what they're doing is never heard of again in the mystical sense. And they're certainly not heard of historically. They're certainly not heard of in any public manifestation, any public representation of their effort. Because in a serious set of quotation marks, you understand, if a quotation mark Buddha had known what he was doing, there would be no such thing as, serious quotation marks, Buddhism. There is no history of anything. It's not just religion. There is no history of anything all the way from physical, actual physical explorations to non-physical, internal, metaphorical ones. There is no history of any such thing, if indeed the people involved at the time knew what they were doing. Now this does not mean that there's some way that people at the time can know what they're doing. It's not a mistake they made. But it is again the division between what men say and the reality of what actually, by their own experience, is demonstratively true. Now back to that which, regardless of you peddling water and trying to deny it, is connected to that. Remember, I gave you a nice, simplistic, or an easy to understand progression of stages that at a quite physical, direct, simplistic one, that we have one environment wherein a shark is the dominating force. Unconditional dominating is the top of the food chain, is the most dominant creature. It is the ultimate eater and cannot be himself et. And then a creature bearing no physical, or not possessing physical attributes to overcome a shark, but through another method can step into an environment where there is something unquestionably dominating. That there is one thing unquestionably at the top end of the food chain, man can step in and by extracting, at least in part, this creature from its natural environment, overcome it. The second stage being, should be fairly simple to see. I could use it in many other ways, but the simple one is use civilization. The whole aspect of the output of man's invented mental world, or the world that is the output of man's mental inventions. And you can look at it then as the water being the level of consciousness, or the arbitrary ad hoc division between man's mind and his body, and that civilization itself is the part of man's mind above the water level, overcoming that which could be represented by my shark in the first stage of man's feral, uncivilized, biosurvival physical instincts. But the mind has to pull them out of their natural environment. I know I didn't spend much time on that. I'm just assuming you people get it. There's no way it has to be pulled out of its natural environment in one real respect. And in case that's not clear, you cannot take a child or an adult, a child turning into an adult. You cannot take such a person and speak to their mind and say, now listen, we're what you call civilized. Look around at our family. We are considered civilized. We live in the midst of civilized people. There are rules by which we live. And they start enumerating. As I said, most of them can be just included and don't take what's not yours. But they can run down the 10 Commandments. They can say that the rules are either clerical or mundane. They can look at it from a judicial or a moralistic standpoint, but they will simply say they're rules that we live by. But all civilized rules are in conflict with the biosurvival instincts of man. There's nothing forbidden man. Man does not forbade himself anything that is not natural, that is instinctive. Men do not pass laws against that which they do not want to do instinctively. So there's nobody, no one, no sane, soundly wired person can be directly told to the mind in stage 2, listen, here's the things we do not do. And we do not take other kids' food. We do not take their toys just because you want them. When they get a little older, you say you do not take sex from other people that do not want to give it. You don't take anything that's not yours. There's no way you do not, the mind, in this case it apparently is coming from external sources like your parents or your civilization itself, it cannot go directly and you just tell the mind, all right, overcome the shark. That is, you cannot tell someone. It still does not work, whether they're a child or a grown-up. It is not that simple. You do not simply tell the mind, every time the body wants to grab something that's not it, from now on, don't ever do it again. And a man's mind go, gotcha, gotcha. Or to tell a man, listen, every time you see someone else's wife, someone else's woman, and you decide you'd like to have sex with her, just don't do it. Just put it out of your mind. Guy goes, gotcha, gotcha. You know it's not so. That is not the way it works. It has to be. The mind has to pull the shark out of its natural environment. Because if you just turn the mind, none of this is physically possible as simplistically as I'm putting it, but I assume you can follow it. Looking at the division in an ordinary man, the civilized, the living between his civilized self and his biosurvival self that is not civilized, you do know the body has no morality. It's not right or wrong. It's got nothing to do with forces of good and evil. The sex organs, the stomach, the whole body seeking comfort and shelter has no morality. A man's body has no more morality. This is not any sort of assault upon man, but you've got to waste all your time not to simply have a non-verbal, non-discussing, non-debatable awareness of the fact that from the body, including Buddha's, Muhammad, Moses, your grandmother, the body has no morality. None. Well, it has one morality, survive. That's the ultimate morality. But it has no morality, and the mind cannot, no one's mind can simply be informed that here are the rules. And it goes into the mind, such as, thou shalt not take what is not thine. The guy goes, well, if you can put that in everyday English, maybe I'll get it. Don't take what's not yours. And so it goes on a man's mind. He goes, gotcha. And you say, no, wait a minute, kid. I'm serious. You have got to live by this. And the kid or whoever it is go, okay, Serious. Okay, got you. Now, are you taking this seriously? Oh, yeah. I mean it. There are no exceptions. And the kid or whoever it is said, oh, I understand that. I can tell how serious you are. You go, okay now. Never again. Kid goes, okay, never again. You know it's foolishness. You know it's absolute, patent foolishness. In a way, which I'm not going to any further, even metaphorically, the mind has to get the vital survival instincts, the desires of the body. It has to be able to pull it, at least partially, out of the water to overcome it. You have got to pull the instincts partially into an unnatural environment. You do see it, don't you? It's simply you have got to be able, the mind, to stop the instincts. That is, there you are, and you see something, it's in a store, or you see somebody's food that they left on a plate, or they leave on a counter, and you just walk by, and you're fairly hungry. And there it is, and you start to, the body would just reach out and take it. That's natural. That is a shark in the water. And you start to do this, the mind has to drag that instinctive desire, that natural desire. Read the shark in the first stage of my story. The mind has to be able to pull the desire partially out of the water. It can't stay in the water. The mind, this metaphor, this simile is not perfect. But you can either hear it or you don't. The mind cannot, at the level of the body, get into a debate like, don't take that food. And if the body could talk, if the shark could talk, or the body could talk, it'd say, why? And you go, it's not right. And the body goes, not right. And they keep on. You go, no, really, it's not right. And the body go, what not right? And you go, it's just not right. We don't do that sort of thing. And the body goes, what do you mean we? Well, what's this we? I'm hungry. There's food. And they go, no. Us Christians, us Jews, us, decent Greeks, us Icelanders, we do not take that which is not ours. The body is not a Greek, it's not a Jew, it's not a Catholic. The body is hungry. You understand, but you're not going to get anywhere in that case, in this kind of scenario, reasoning with the body, because the body is still a shark in the water, and you're not going to overcome it. The body has to have some, which it does with sane people, it just happens. It's already wired in there. But the body has to have the inclination. It has to have a kind of weakness, but it has to have an inclination. The shark has to give a little bit. For a man to even be able to, even though he cannot physically overcome him, he has to be able to entice the shark partially out of the water. That is, he's got to be able to dangle bait and fish the shark into taking something and then pull him to at least get his head out of the water and hold him there long enough for him to suffocate. In the same way, the mind has to induce the body to get above the water line, because if it stays below the water, you can't, quote, reason with it. Of course, all that's foolishness because the body can't talk, but the mind cannot turn to the body and say, don't do that. And it go, why? If it could ask. And it go, because we have decided to apply ourselves to a civilized standard of conduct. And the body goes. You have to get the body, you have to entice it, you have to be able to hook it, which I say is not something that you actually learn. We're already wired up to do it. But what happens is, unbeknownst to you, unplanned by you, unwittingly, anyone who is sane and civilized, they are continually able to pull the shark partially out of the water. That is, they are able to overcome the uncivilized, immoral, it's really amoral, desires of the body. It has to be able to at least distract them long enough to entice them like, well, come on up here and discuss it with me. We shouldn't do that. And the body goes, They go, come on, really? Hey, listen to me a minute. Wait, don't grab the food. They'll be there in a second. But listen to me a minute. And you keep doing that, and it's like moment to moment. It's the only way people stay civilized, to put it real crudely. Is you just have to keep sort of distracting the shark, getting it, all right. Back to the third level. Does anyone see that we're now not talking about being civilized? We're not talking about being better people, and we're not talking about an actual conflict between man's mind and his vile survival instincts, which is valid enough. It is a valid, genuine, useful, metaphorical picture as per my second stage. But that's as far as it ever goes, ordinary people. That's as high as any ordinary person ever gets with this. No matter what people will say, ordinary people, not disingenuously, they're not actually lying to you, but people will say, well, that individual, they'll say that the greatest achievement a man could hope for would be to become a true Muslim. a true practicing Jew or a Christian or just a good American or just a good humanist. They can say that. But all they're saying is they're describing what it would be if, above the waterline, the mind of man had total control over their survival instincts. And of course, still assuming you're sane and wouldn't hurt yourself. But the point is, you would never take that which is not yours. The whole world would be civilized. The whole world would be as close as ordinary men can dream of paradise. That is not what this is about. What this is about, you have to forget. You have to, or not forget, but you have to take it to another level. I went from this whole scene of all the oceans into one man's head, but one whole man. Now forget the man, it's inside of just the head. Because now the relationship is from a man, from a shark to everything else in the ocean, then from a man to a shark, and then from a man's mind to a man's body, now to something else. This whole thing now is in the mind. Two kinds of mind, two kinds of thought. Life generated down here, and the potential of self generated. Down here is what is representative of civilization, the biosurvival instincts of man, the shark. It is everything that makes man survive mentally. And the reason this sounds strange, I know, is no one ever thinks about the fact, everyone, any sane person, can certainly have no disagreement that there are natural, instinctive, indigenous, but instinctive biosurvival drives in everyone that keeps us physically alive. Everyone knows that. Were it not so, you wouldn't be alive. But when you start saying, if you try to point out that in the same way, but non-physically, there are native, instinctive survival drives here, the mind just shuts down. And for very good reason. Because if that's all you have to look with down here, and you say, and you point out what it is, we're back to holding a mirror in front of a mirror and saying, what do you see? And I go, huh? And that's about the most intelligent thing that can be said, is what? It is this. It is the attempt for man to produce his own thoughts to overcome those generated by life. Not the mind to overcome the body, not to his civil, decent side to overcome his indecent, feral side. It's got nothing to do with the body other than the fact that all trees stand in the ground. But it has to do with him attempting to generate his own thoughts to overcome, to pull out of their natural environment, or what I was trying to get to tonight, to overcome the life-generated thoughts. But to do so, you have got to pull them out of their natural environment, which I guess I'll pick up next time. That's what this is about. This is what it's always been about, is to overcome them. But by the same way that a man can only overcome a shark by getting it out of its natural environment, at least in part, for a person's individually self-generated thoughts to have any potential to overcome those generated by life, you have got to at least partially pull them out of their natural environment. Anybody essentially give you something to think about till then.